I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine the latest. Today, as continued attacks on civilians in the Kherson area suggest Russia's so-called human safari is ongoing, we report on Putin's annual press conference, where he said Russia had reached all its goals in Syria.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Thursday, the 19th of December, 2 years and 305 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by Assistant Comment Editor Francis Dearnley and former tank unit commander and chemical, biological and nuclear weapons expert Hamish de Bretton. I'll start with the latest military updates. Ukraine's Navy and the SBU, the Security Service of Ukraine, said to have conducted a joint attack against the Novoshakhtinsk oil refinery in Russia's Rostov Oblast last night. This comes from the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces. That site is about 10 kilometres over the border into Russia, but that at the moment is around 200 kilometres from the nearest Ukrainian lines. Russian authorities and telegram channels report explosions and a fire at the facility. An SBU source told the Kyiv Independent that SBU drones attacked the facility first to distract Russian air defences, and that then provided a window for Ukrainian-made missiles to hit the facility. Now, Yuri Slusia, who's the acting governor of Rostov Oblast, said the fire had been extinguished by 6:45 local this morning. One person was reported injured in the region due to falling drone debris, although none of that can be verified. That refinery had previously been hit in March and July this year. And as I say, it's only just over the border, but still, some distance from the front lines, but it hit twice earlier this year, which makes you wonder, where's the air defence? Separately, inside Ukraine, all 85 drones fired by Russia overnight were brought down, 40 by electronic warfare, 45 shot down. However, 2 Iskander-M ballistic missiles got through. They landed at Kryvyi Rih, we think only causing injuries rather than deaths, but also a Kh-59-69 variant guided bomb got through as well. One policeman was killed by shelling in Chernihiv, and in Kherson region, down in the south, the human safari, the so-called human safari, seems to be continuing. There have been numerous reports over recent weeks of drones dropping, first-person view drones, attack drones, causing damage and injuries and deaths, or dropping munitions. There's some suggestion the drones are dropping metal, almost sort of pyramid structures to puncture car tyres, so the car is then subject to attack by a grenade. Anyway, another man was killed today in these so-called, like I say, on these attacks that have been called human safari. But we shouldn't look away from there. Something particularly grim happening in the Kherson region. Elsewhere, very little movement on the ground, a bit to the south of Pokrovsk in the Donbass region. We've talked about that quite a lot, and I say sort of creeping advances, a few hundred metres a day. Let's just take a quick picture there. So Pokrovsk, imagine the city of Pokrovsk, put that in the middle of a clock face. The Russian forces at the moment are ranged from about the 3 o'clock position through 6 to the 7 o'clock. Now, they're not evenly distributed. Some are closer to the city than others. But from the 3 o'clock position, Russian forces are about 15 k's away. Then at 4 o'clock, they're about 10 kilometres. And then at 6 and 7 o'clock, about 5 kilometres. So quite close to the south and the southwest. However, that 7 o'clock position, 5 k's away from the city, that is the extent of Russia's advance at the moment. Everywhere from there, except to the southeast back towards Donetsk city, is currently in Ukrainian hands. No change to positions in Kursk. Now, as I say, that's in no way to suggest things are easy or less violent than in recent months. Speaking this phone call, apparently after a phone call with the head of Britain's armed forces, Ukraine's Commander-in-Chief Alexander Syrsky said Russian troops have intensified attacks in several areas across the front line in the last few days, but have so far failed to break through in a meaningful way through Ukraine's defensive lines. Ukraine's General Staff said that there was a total of 250 frontline clashes in the last 24 hours. Now, General Syrsky said In the heavy battles, Ukrainian defence forces did not allow Russian forces to breach the defence and achieve operational success in any direction. He also said, according to Tony Radakin, who's the head of Britain's armed forces, that London will, quote, significantly increase certain aspects of its support for Ukraine in 2025. Now, what does that mean? What does significantly increase mean? Well, maybe the answer was partly supplied last night with an announcement. And I'm going to dwell on this for a moment because it riled my rockets, if that's the word. It got my goat. Here's the announcement from the British MOD. UK leadership on Ukraine continues as Defence Secretary announces £225 million support package during Kyiv visit. This press statement continued. It said, Defence Secretary visits Ukraine and sets out new plan of UK military support for Ukraine in 2025, including more equipment and enhanced training. New £225 million package of military support announced, including new drones, boats and munitions. John Healey visits Kyiv today, meeting his counterpart Rustem Umerov to discuss the latest battlefield situation. So I looked at that. I thought, that's all right, 225 million quid, not bad. And then, of course, it's in the detail. I was a bit annoyed. This is not all British money. I don't know why they had to do this. Britain's been a stalwart supporter of Ukraine in money, political leadership and military donation. They didn't need to try and play fast and loose with a press statement. But when you look into the detail, £186 million of that 225 package comes from the International Fund for Ukraine. Now, the MOD's own website says that the International Fund for Ukraine is administered by the UK, but takes financial contributions from the UK, Norway, Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden and Lithuania, with occasional additional support from Iceland, Australia and New Zealand. So some of that 186 million will have come from the UK, but definitely not all, and we don't know how much. I spoke to the MOD to confirm this, to make sure I wasn't absolutely barking, and this is correct. This is what an MOD spokesman told me. Now, that remaining 39 million for electronic warfare, respirators and a few other bits and pieces is coming from the UK. I was particularly unhappy with the way this statement was worded. It says, as a quote, direct quote from the statement, today's £225 million package of UK military support is further evidence of our commitment. That's the quote. Now, the clear implication, which was picked up by a number of media outlets, including the Telegraph and our online edition, because this happened yesterday evening, is that all that support is from the UK. Have a look at the British MOD's Twitter feed now, at Defence HQ. They've still got it. They're still running tweets. I mean, fair enough to publicise this, but it's the very clear inference is that it's all from the UK, and it's just wrong. It's just cheeky. You don't need to do it. It's a bit of an own goal. It takes away a little bit of the gloss from an otherwise very good announcement, and it gets, gobs on sticks like me complaining. But anyway, what's the money for? A lot of maritime stuff in the 186 million, small boats, maritime drones, loitering munitions, and then elsewhere, air defence, electronic warfare, respirators, as I said, and 90,000 charges, so the charges for the 155mm artillery shells. So a good announcement, but mired by, some very poor comms handling. Enough, I will get off my soapbox. Couple more from me. NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte welcomed Lithuania's President Gitanas Nausėda to NATO HQ in Brussels yesterday. Mr. Rutte thanked President Nausėda for hosting a German-led force, part of the EFP, the Enhanced Forward Presence Force of NATO. And he also welcomed the fact that Germany is going to be permanently stationing a brigade in Lithuania that will be at full operational capability by 2027 with just short of 5,000 soldiers. Mark Rutte said that Lithuania is a leader in defence spending, investing over 3% of GDP now in defence, and that figure rising to 3.5% soon. And he also praised the plan to build a new 155mm artillery shell factory in Lithuania in conjunction with the defence contractor Rheinmetall. Now, a couple of things came out of the Q&A that are worth highlighting. Mr. Rutte talked about what he said were rumours going around about what a peace deal could look like. We've covered this on this pod. Mark Rutte said, I believe what we should focus on now is making sure that Ukraine gets to a position of strength. If we now start to discuss amongst ourselves what a peace deal could look like, we make it so easy for the Russians, because they sit there in their reclining chairs, listening to our discussions, smoking a nice cigar, whilst watching all this TV footage, and I don't think that's helpful. Of course, this is unavoidable in democracies, that we discuss these things in the open, but I think we'd be very wise to put some lid on this and focus on the business at hand. And the business at hand is to make sure that Ukraine has what it needs to prevent Putin from winning. Well, that's quite interesting, quite colourful, reclining chairs and cigars right up Dearnley Street. But anyway, nice, interesting words from Mr. Rutte. He then went on, he carried on, he was asked if we're safe, if we, NATO, are safe. And he said, we are safe. Yes, for now we are safe. But I'm not so sure about 4 or 5 years from now, when you look at the huge defence production taking place in Russia, in China. Interesting he mentioned China. In China, the investments the Russians are making at the moment. If we stick to the 2% pledge, yes, we are safe now, absolutely. But in 4 or 5 years, we might be in big difficulty. And that's why we need to do 2 things now. We have to decide fast on spending more, and we have to discuss what exactly that level would be. We will do it over the coming months, and we have to absolutely ramp up defence production. So very clear calls there from the head of NATO saying that this 2% pledge is no longer fit for purpose, and that figure, 4 or 5 years, is quite stark. Interesting to see. I mean, he's new in the job. And obviously you've got Donald Trump coming in on the 20th of January. But Mr. Rutte already kind of setting out his stall, saying more money is required. Maybe he's working with the grain of the argument, expecting to get similar calls from America, in which case it'll be very interesting to see what the other allies say to that. OK, last one for me. Just breaking in the last hour, Swedish police have boarded the Chinese flagship Yipeng 3, the one that's wanted in Sweden for questioning over the breach of 2 undersea fibre optic cables back in November. Now, she's been stationary in waters nearby for the last month while diplomats in Stockholm and Beijing discuss the matter. Danish authorities also known to have been involved in facilitating the visit on board. So interesting to see what's going to come out of that. The Yipeng 3, I think they've admitted that they were responsible for cutting the cables, but they said they were dragging an anchor rather than it being an overtly malicious act. Yeah, lots of allegedlys and bunny ears going on around that. OK, now then, over to Mr. Armchair and Cigar. Firstly, Francis, John Foreman, former UK Defence Attaché to Moscow and Kiev, friend of the pod. He says that today's annual press conference and the question and answer session by Putin in Moscow is the usual mix of, quote, bluster, boastfulness, braggadocio, brown-nosing and barefaced lies. Now, Francis, he's a gooner, so his judgment is impeccable. But what have you made of the press conference so far?
Thanks, Don. Well, you'll be disappointed to hear that I'm not sitting in a nice armchair smoking a cigar. If you are looking for a festive tradition, I'd recommend another other than this rather turgid press conference where you, as John says, get the answers you pay for. It is really just an exercise in seeing what the Kremlin wants the world to see, rather than it being something where you actually learn very much at all in the factual department. But let's look at some of the headlines that have come out of it. So I think the most interesting thing is the way that Putin is pivoting, or maybe pivoting, on the subject of negotiations. So he said Russia is getting closer to achieving its objectives in Ukraine. Some are saying that would signal that Moscow may well be ready to talk if the terms are right. He went on to say that Russia was prepared for negotiations and that politics is the art of compromise. He then argued that Ukraine is the one that doesn't want to talk. He said Kyiv pulled out of the talks when the war started because former Prime Minister of Britain, Boris Johnson, with the great hair, travelled to Ukraine and said they need to fight to the last Ukrainian. I don't think there's any left, he added. Now, I focus in on that because, as you'll know, this is a classic example of Russian disinformation. There is no evidence for this claim from any sources in Ukraine or in the British government. Indeed, we put this directly to Boris Johnson in our interview with him a couple of weeks ago, and he denied it outright and went into a great amount of detail as to what really took place in those meetings. And he goes into, again, a lot of detail about that meeting in his memoir, which I also would recommend if you're interested in some of the key meetings that took place when he was Prime Minister. Now, Putin went on, he said that Russia is ready for negotiations with Zelensky too, but only if he wins an election. Just incredible, isn't it? But he added that in his view, Zelensky's government was not the legitimate authority, and so that there was somebody else that he felt he could talk to in Ukraine if it came to it. He also reiterated that any talks with Ukraine should be held on the basis of the reality on the front. Of course, we've heard that line many times. He then went on to gloat about the occupied areas of Ukraine, saying that they will be brought up to a Russian standard. He's pledged to reconstruct occupied Ukrainian territory, saying that work is underway in a number of spheres, including housing, cultural sites and public spaces. He also spoke of a construction boom in the city of Mariupol, which of course has been occupied by Russian forces since May 2022. According to the Russian-installed mayor there, thousands of construction workers have been brought in to rebuild the city, and indeed there is a lot of satellite imagery that would be suggestive of that being the truth. But just clear evidence there of Moscow seeking to use those reconstruction efforts in cities like that as evidence that they're doing good work in the occupied territories and helping the people there, when, as you'll hear later this week or early next week, the reality of life in the occupied territories is very different indeed. And that was something we were focused on our time in Kharkiv. Other things that Putin was speaking about is the need for an experiment on Western air defences by launching Oreshnik at Kyiv. That's sometimes described as an intercontinental ballistic missile. It technically isn't, but it's often been described as such, and I'll continue to use that term just because people know then what we're talking about. Putin, he suggested a high-tech duel with the West being something that could happen by launching that missile against Kyiv to prove whether or not Western air defences could intercept it. He suggested that they couldn't. It's the typical bluster we've come to expect from Putin in these kind of situations. I mean, he could have had this high-tech duel last month when we were there in Ukraine, but of course he didn't attack Kyiv. He attacked Dnipro because, of course, there was a chance, probably a high probability chance, that Kyiv would be able to shoot down that missile using their air defences, so he targets somewhere else instead that doesn't have as many air defence assets. Now, just one other interesting thing I wanted to pick up on that Putin spoke about is that he said that Russia was not defeated in Syria. He said that Bashar al-Assad was ousted by Islamist-led rebels that had been backed by the West. He said that the Russia had reached its goals in Syria, admitted that the future of the two remaining bases there was uncertain, but seemingly had no regrets about the way in which Russia's conducted itself in Syria. He went on, he said he hadn't spoken yet to former President Assad since he fled to Moscow on December 8th, but that he was planning to do so soon. So that's basically the top lines coming out of the I was going to say meet and greet. It's not quite that, but you know what I mean. The press conference so far with people dialing in, they tend to go on for about 3 or 4 hours. There may well be a few more interesting lines, and if there are, then of course we'll cover them in tomorrow's podcast. But for now, let's just go over to Ukraine and its allies, because long and important meetings are currently taking place between Zelensky and Yermak and Western leaders. One last night went on until 1 a.m, according to Zelensky, and he said peace is possible if we stand united against Russian madness. And he said that the priority for them at the moment was security guarantees. Now, whether that be within the NATO model or security guarantees outside of the NATO model is not clear. But as we have discussed many times, there is a widespread belief that NATO is not likely to be on the table. And so perhaps there are conversations taking place between other Western allies about what security guarantees would be enough for Kyiv and would be enough as a deterrent to stop Russia from invading again. Zelensky went on, together with America, Europe has the power to pressure Russia into a real peace through strength will surely come. Now, the major European Council meeting is today, highly anticipated, with Kaja Kallas leading the charge on this. She has effectively opened it by talking to the press today, and she said there's no point pushing Zelensky to talk when Putin doesn't want to talk. Russia does not want peace. The big question is, what is the security guarantee we can provide? If it is not troops, if it is not long-range weapons, then what is it that actually protects you? She also spoke as well about Russian disinformation efforts and how they are another tool in this war. She said there is a war taking place off the battlefield, Russia's war of disinformation. And I would say that you won't find another example that's better of Russian disinformation than the lines that have been pumped out minute by minute in the press conference today by Putin. So if you're looking for an annual tradition, I would suggest a better one than this one. But that's where we are, Dom.
Lovely, thanks, Francis. I mean, it is extraordinary. We covered it for the last couple of years, but just as John says, the barefaced lies and the bluster, it's absolutely extraordinary. I thought that line about the high-tech duel with the Oreshnik was particularly interesting. It's like, well, go for it. Go try the high-tech duel against Kyiv. Of course, he couldn't do, because there's a lot more air defence, as you say, around Kyiv, and if it's shot down, then where does he go from there? This new latest weapon and all the rest of it that gets shot down. So, really interesting to see. The line about Syria, that all his aims were met in Syria and they weren't defeated and so on and so forth, just really interesting. And I wonder this, it's quite if you look at reports, for example, by our colleague Steve Rosenberg at the BBC, reports this week from the papers following the assassination of General Kirillov, with the scooter bomb. I mean, there's quite a fevered atmosphere at the moment in Moscow. People are paying attention to this thing, the movements in the war. They're feeling a little nervous. There is some commentary in the papers, which you don't often see, which must speak of some deeper currents that are being picked up. And I just wonder if some of these more egregious lies are, in this current atmosphere, how they land, or whether people are feeling a bit nervous in Russia and want actual answers rather than just putting up with the usual. We all know it's a bit of a game. Interesting. Anyway, Hamish, delighted to welcome you back. Been a bit of a busy week. I mean, you've the second time this week I think we've invited you on, but that's because you are absolutely the right person to help us decipher what's going on. Now, Britain's Defence Secretary John Healey has opened the door to British troops being sent to Ukraine to help train the country's soldiers. He said Britain needs to, quote, make the training a better fit for what the Ukrainians need. He was speaking to the Times, sister paper The Times, sister, cousin, don't know, annoying fraternal sibling, don't know, in Kyiv. But he said, we need to make it easier for the Ukrainians to access, and we need to work with the Ukrainians to help them motivate and mobilise more recruits. Now, when he was asked if that meant extending the training of Ukrainian recruits inside the country itself, he said, we'll look wherever we can to respond to what the Ukrainians want. They are the ones fighting. We've discussed these kind of models before. I mean, I asked the former Defence Secretary Grant Shapps about different models for training. Could they use veterans, for example, inside Ukraine? He didn't say yes at the time, but he certainly didn't shut that question down. But Hamish, you've been involved in earlier versions of Operation Interflex, the British training model. What are your thoughts about this suggestion, and what did you take from that interview with Mr. Healey?
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Apologies for being on twice this week. But yeah, let me just unpick it a little bit. As you've discussed, things are, the stakes are rising in the conflict. I think Putin was humiliated in Syria and humiliated in Moscow with the assassination of his key general and ally Kirillov on his doorstep. And as you've discussed in his annual question and answer session on international TV, he's clearly lying through his teeth, trying to appear swan-like above the water, but we all know that he's peddling like fury below it. However, these are tricky times all round, and the Ukraine army is getting tired, is getting exhausted, and is desperately in need of fresh soldiers to bolster the front lines, which have been heavily squeezed in some places by the relentless meat grinder tactics of the Russians and the North Koreans. And I think it was last week, the UK MOD intelligence update was saying Putin was losing about 2,000 soldiers every day. Now, he can maintain this with North Korean mercenaries, though I don't expect they're receiving any special pay. It's probably just their bloated and ridiculous leader, Kim Jong-un, who's set to gain anything, which unfortunately for the rest of the planet is probably nuclear know-how. And unfortunately, President Zelensky just can't magic up soldiers like Putin can. So I, for one, welcome the apparent move by the British government to potentially conduct the basic training for Ukraine soldiers in Ukraine rather than the UK. Currently, the batches of about 2,000 to 3,000 Ukraine soldiers are coming to the UK for about 6 weeks of basic infantry training and then returning to the front lines. In all, this takes about 9 weeks of travel and administration. Now, the training is excellent and they leave with some decent kit. However, it's not the most efficient way when Zelensky is desperate for every soldier to man the trenches and weapon systems. So if we move the 100 or so British-led, and there are other Western teams in there, Australians and New Zealanders, teams to Ukraine, we can increase the tempo of training soldiers almost exponentially. potentially almost doubling the throughput in probably the same time. Presumably, also, this would appeal to the Ukrainians, and that's what Healy has been suggesting. You don't have to leave their families for 2 or 3 months, and will also improve the quality of the training, in my opinion, by being close to the battle space, able to more quickly react to changes in the fight and operating procedures. I mean, for instance, in my area, now that the Russians are using chemical weapons on an industrial scale in the Donbass, these Ukrainian soldiers must be trained to be able to fight in this contaminated environment. Hitherto, by the time knowledge like that gets back to the UK and a training program is written, many thousands will succumb to the gas. But if the teams are on site, as it were, this can be done in some days rather than weeks. Now, I know many people will shout that this would signify NATO boots on the ground and become a target for Russian airstrikes. But this is how we, the UK, trained the Ukraine forces before the war. So administratively, it should be fairly straightforward. And Ukraine has shown by its extensive training in secret for the Kursk offensive that they can effectively mask this type of activity. And I bet all those in Interflex will be very keen to support this if given the opportunity. This should also, in my opinion, be another psychological fillip for the Ukrainians and another mental blow for Putin. And seeing him floundering around in his chat with the nation today, I judge he's under real pressure. And with the knowledge that, his fellow tyrant Assad has crashed recently and is now cowering under Putin's coattails, it must be pretty disarming experience for Putin. So, I applaud this potential move. I wish it'd been done earlier, but like the tanks and the fighter jets, better late than never. And of course, we have the Trump hurricane building up ahead of steam in the Atlantic and due landfall in the Black Sea too long. So, in sum, I think if this comes to fruition, it will be a positive step and hopefully increase the tempo of creating new soldiers for Ukraine and is to be applauded.
Thanks, Hamish. And now over to Francis for our latest dispatch from Kharkiv.
And now our latest dispatch from the frontline city of Kharkiv, where we speak to a young volunteer who found a new purpose in life in helping to coordinate aid during this terrible war. 21-year-old Ilya works with the aid organisation Humanity and Inclusion. That's the one we're supporting as part of this year's Christmas charity appeal in David's memory. Ilya is from the neighbouring region of Poltava, just west of Kharkiv. The two cities are about 140 kilometres apart. You'll also hear from our Ukrainian interpreter, Luda, who is from the Poltava region too. The interpreters we work with in Ukraine have their own stories to tell, and Luda has had first-hand experience both of becoming a refugee and of helping others who've been displaced by this war. I started by asking Ilya about his life before the full-scale invasion.
Before 24th of February 2022, I was a law student in my town city, Poltava. I was living a normal life, like every student's lessons, lectures.
Poltava is a location that will be familiar to listeners because of the military activity there. Perhaps just briefly you can describe what has been happening there in the course of the war and at the moment.
At the beginning, so many people were arriving from other regions of Ukraine, especially from Kharkiv, because Poltava is one of the nearest other regions to Kharkiv. At the beginning, we were seeing many people who were fleeing their homes because of the danger that they were facing in Kharkiv. And at the beginning, many people were fleeing from Poltava to other regions as well.
And tell me about your memories of the full-scale invasion. Did it come as a huge shock to you personally?
We had before rumors, news that this will start, but we never truly were thinking that this will happen. And yes, I've discovered that by the sound of air alarm in the morning at 5 a.m. This was shocking to everyone. Everyone started tracing news channels to see what is happening.
And so the full-scale invasion begins. From the perspective of a student, did you know immediately then that your life would change? Or was there a sense of, okay, this has happened, life has to continue?
I would say that life changed immediately because after that we didn't have any universities working, and we were seeing that we need to help many people. They didn't have anything. They were just fleeing with their families. That's why I decided to become a volunteer.
So talk to me a little bit more about the day-to-day work of trying to help these people. So they arrive into a town, into an oblast that is not prepared infrastructurally for that number of people. What do you do? What is the literal step-by-step process of when these people arrive? Talk me through it.
When these people arrived, we were trying to find for them accommodation, as well as basic needs such as food, just to find a place where they could live, because Poltava is a city with 300,000 population. After this, it's become a city of 500 or 600,000 people. So you can see how many people were searching for a safe place in Poltava. When people were arriving, it was literally thousands of people who were in queues waiting to be registered for their assistance. It was cash assistance for them, so they will be able to buy basic items that you need in your life.
When it comes to the accommodation specifically, where were these people being placed? Were they being found families to stay with, or was it disused buildings? I'm just interested in practically where these people can be placed when, as you say, the settlement is not designed for anywhere near that number of people.
Many people were placed in schools and kindergarten. These places weren't anymore functioning as schools, so people were living for months in these institutions. Some people were trying to find accommodation to rent, but I think that most of the people, they were living in institutions such as kindergarten or schools.
And talk to me a little bit about the mental state of the people when they arrived. Were they in shock? Were they emotional? Were they resilient? I'm interested in the general atmosphere when these people arrived.
Each person was in a different mood. Some of them were resilient, some of them were emotional because they lost everything. But overall, I think that people were trying to be resilient to what is happening.
Were you particularly unusual as being as young as you were when you started volunteering? You must have been not much older than 19, 20. Was that typical?
It's not so typical. Of course, I met other people who were my age volunteering, but mostly it was people starting from 20 years, but I started volunteering when I was 18 years old.
And if you could just paint a picture for us, just describe what the city became like when that huge influx of people arrived.
The city was not ready for such a huge amount of people arriving in the city. In the mornings and overall during the day, the city was full of traffic jams, full of people on the streets, because many organizations were providing assistance. And when you were walking in the city center, you could see that here is the queue of people, here is queue of people. So you could see impact that all this has on the city.
And Luda, you were, in a sense, on the receiving end of this kind of support because you were in the Poltava region. Can you describe what it was like from the other perspective?
I was one of the refugee, and everything that he is speaking now is just so touching, and I'm almost to cry about this. So because it's almost some flashbacks from this. So, and due to such volunteers, so we were able to get at least something that we need for daily life. This humanitarian assistance, it was so pivotal, I may say. So after 2.5 years has passed. First of all, we are very grateful, we as Kharkiv local people, for this hospitality, because without that, I cannot even imagine how would we survive. Because after jet, we were flying very, very low under your house, and you can hear some explosions. It was awful and terrifying. So that's why, first of all, I may say that my husband, my daughter and I, it was about 4 a.m. we arrived. We didn't understand where we are. And one volunteer, it was a young girl, she gave some kind of key of the flat. We have never been there before. And she said, this is your accommodation. As much as you need, so you may use it. And my first question was, could you please give me the telephone number of the host of this, because I want to say thank you in the morning. So these people didn't know us, we didn't know them, but they shared the apartment with us, and they were so kind and warm-hearted with this. Next morning at 8 a.m., of course, we called her and say, hello, my name is Ludmila. And she said, I'm Gala. And so this is our flat. This is your flat. You may enjoy it. And I may say, as a refugee in this case, or maybe internally displaced people, first of all, maybe you have lost everything. But on the third day, my daughter and I, we have found another humanitarian organization. We started to cook for our military, for evacuated people, because it was the biggest evacuation in March. And then we decided to help with doing something more, and I was registered as one of assistant maybe in the humanitarian hub. So we started to help other people who are, as we are, we're refugees, and due to these organizations, we managed to survive and we managed to be stable mentally, because it involved us to do something, not being idle. And every time I may say that thank you, Poltava region, for this warm heart invitation. And now we are best friends with these hosts, I mean Galina, and we see each other. We have traveled with them, and we are very, very thankful for such organizations as Ilya has.
Thank you. That's really interesting. So, Ilya, we've just described there the first phase of the evacuations. Talk me through the following weeks, once perhaps things settled down somewhat into a routine. What was phase 2?
I think that was people were still arriving, and we were just registering people at the office. Hundreds of people who were passing through our office each day. That lasted for months. After everything settled down, we started working in Oblast, not in the Poltava city, to help people who were residing there, not in the Poltava city, because Poltava city was overwhelmed with people, but also people within our region. You were working 12 hours per day because of the roads, conditions. So in Poltava, your office would be already built, and everything was functioning to register people. In rural areas, this was not established at all. Each day, we were in the new place, and we were establishing it over and over and over again.
So talk to me about how you got involved with humanity and inclusion specifically, and the way in which that organisation helps here.
It was December 2022. We just saw as volunteers that Humanity Inclusion is planning to help people in Poltava region. I passed an interview and started working with HI as a social worker. We were helping people mostly in rural areas. My department was working as an entry point department, which is identifying people who are in need. We were also collaborating with other organizations to have comprehensive approach between all our humanitarian community. And now I am in the position of protection project manager in Kharkiv city. And if we would never identifying people who are in need, nobody will ever know that these people exist and that they are in need.
It's just huge logistical challenge. You just have the bureaucratic challenge of finding people to help before you can even be, in the practical sense, helping them is perhaps an underappreciated aspect of this. A lot of responsibility for somebody 21 years old. And so obviously you were a student. All of a sudden you're being thrust into a full-time job, as it were, as a volunteer. Were you sad to give up your studies?
I didn't give up my study. I continued it during evenings, or sometimes I was joining online classes when we were visiting rural areas. For the first year, I think we had only online. So I kept my study and I finished it.
Congratulations. I mean, I can't even begin to contemplate how difficult that must have been when you're in those extremely challenging circumstances, then switch into the mentality of studying.
In the first months, I think it was difficult to switch, but after time, it's helping me not to be so stressed, to concentrate on other things and to forget about things that are happening around you.
Academic life is all about memorizing obscure dates and names and intellectual at work, but I can imagine the practical skills you had to develop were quite different. What skills did you learn from doing your volunteer work?
First of all, it's resilience. Then it is, I think, management as well as English language skills, because all programs that we used, they were developed in English language with no Ukrainian provided.
That explains why your English is so good.
I thought that I didn't speak very well English before, but I discovered during my interview that I speak some English, because it was not only my first interview in English, it was my first interview in the entire life. And it was already in English. As I discovered, I had some English skills.
And Nuno, just returning to you described that when you initially arrived in the Poltava region, you found a flat, and over time you befriended those who'd given you the flat, who donated it for the time that you needed it. What happened next? How long were you there for?
So we have been there for almost 8 months. I was afraid to come back to Kharkiv and just even to peep what is going on here. But then I realized that I have severe need maybe to see what is going on here, and I decided that I would come for 2 days, but I have stayed for 2 weeks. Then I came back to Poltava region, and it was my internal desire to come back home. I was afraid, but nevertheless, so we tried to do it, and New Year, so we were celebrating in Kharkiv, and afterwards, 2 months later, we came back, and I'm not going to leave my city, because now we are full of energy, we are full of faith, we are full of our beliefs that we need to go forward, we shouldn't surrender, we need to survive, and we need to do everything that we are able to do. Humanitarian aid, working with military, for example, encourage each other and to stay strong, to be closer to our victory.
Yesterday, when we first met, you said that the people of Kharkiv are particularly proud of their city. It's a very, very strong identity here, perhaps more so than people would appreciate in their own country. It's very striking. Can you tell me why that is and how it manifests itself?
Everyone who is living now here in Kharkiv, we have chosen our route, we have chosen our way of conquering our resilience, even because every day we need to conquer, we need to survive, and we need to understand that no plans, just we need to appreciate everything that we have. And sometimes you may plan everything that you want, but it would be destroyed, Kharkiv is in our blood. This is our heart, so we can't live without our heart. So Kharkiv is forever.
You described there's something that I've heard several Ukrainians say, which is a sense of a rejuvenation of purpose because of the war. I wonder if you can just talk a little bit more about that. And I know that's not saying, that you're in any sense grateful for the war, welcoming the war. Of course, the hardship that this city is enduring is daily, and the horrors nearby on the front line. But I wonder if you can just talk psychologically about what it's meant for the community and for you on an individual level to have this sense of purpose again.
So we were coming back 2 years ago. First of all, of course, everyone was at loss. But for me, it was only for maybe 2 months. So then I decided that I need to do something. We have 3 types of reaction in our stress situations. The first one, it is called freeze. The second one, it is called flee or run, and the third one is to do something. So I have realized that my reaction, I need to do something. Some of my friends, they needed to flee to escape, and it's okay. Now, everyone whose reaction was to flee, so they have fled. Everyone who wanted to be frozen, they have done this. But nowadays, we have only people, or the majority of our people, whose reaction is to do something. So only doing nowadays something very useful for our victory and for not losing our Ukrainian nationality. Some of my acquaintances, they are desperate. They said, we are tired of this. We want to change something, or maybe let's speak about negotiations, So I say that we have 2 options. The first option, to be occupied by Russians. Do you want this? They said, of course, no. So that's why we need to be united. We need to do something, and our reaction is only activity.
And so what would your message be to those who've listened to your words today and who are in a position to help humanity and inclusion and generally volunteer organisations in Ukraine. How urgent is the support they can provide?
This support is urgent because we still have so many people in need who don't get any assistance. It is urgent from the side of humanity to help them and to ensure that these people are provided with the support that they're lacking.
What would be the next big thing that you could do if there was a wave of fundraising that came your way?
I think that the first two things that we would do is to help people with disabilities who are facing difficulties during evacuations right now, because there is no specific infrastructure for that, as well as to help people in transit centers who are arriving currently from different parts of Kharkiv and other oblast regions, to help them as we did before in Poltava. We also need to help people who are living in territories which are near to frontline, as we are doing in humanity inclusion. We are helping people in 30-kilometer zone in Kharkiv and other regions of Ukraine.
And we've been speaking to your colleagues about the work there and have seen some of the people who have formerly lived in the occupied regions and have now still near the front line, but have been moved out. Perhaps you can just very briefly talk about the unique challenges of helping those people.
The most challenge is security situation. It is worsening every day, and that is lowering accessibility of territories, not only for humanity and inclusion, but also for other humanitarian organizations. And if we don't have, due to security concerns, capacity to provide people, they are left with nothing.
Have you had an opportunity to think about life after the war? Do you still want to work as a lawyer or using your law degree, or has the war changed your perspective?
It is something that sometimes I'm thinking of, and I still haven't decided what I would like to do after it. Maybe I would like to go for university in the European Union and to continue my studies there, or maybe I would like to continue my work in humanitarian organizations in other parts of the world. It's still something that I haven't decided, or maybe I will have opportunity to combine it both.
So already looking beyond helping outside of Ukraine after this war is over. Thank you very much for your time. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
If you want to support Humanity and Inclusion, which works directly on the front lines with volunteers and those most vulnerable, please check out the show notes where you'll find a link to donate. There's also lots more information about the charity and their work.
Chaps, keen to come to you for any final thoughts. Francis, if I could start with you, please.
Thanks, Dom. I'm still monitoring the press conference, which is going on as we speak. Somebody just asked Putin whether he's learned anything about himself during the war. Putin replied, "I now joke much less." Then somebody else asked him what he would do differently if he had the chance to go back to February 2022, when the full-scale invasion began. Putin replies, this is really interesting, "Knowing what's happening now, back in 2022, I would have thought the decision ought to have been taken earlier. We ought to have started getting ready for those developments and the special military operation before." Now, that is, I think, revealing on lots of fronts if we reflect on the excuses that Putin gave at the time. He said that he had no choice but to strike exactly when he did because the negotiations, inverted commas, that had been going on behind closed doors had not reached a satisfactory conclusion. This is just basically an admission that he wanted to go as soon as possible, that the negotiations that were going on in the background had little relevance. But also, my goodness, it just reminds me of that question was put to Hitler late in the Second World War, and he said the exact same thing, that he wished he'd gone much earlier when he had all of the advantages in his favour. And he actually blamed Chamberlain. And I know I've talked about this before. Hitler blamed Chamberlain, even though we blamed Chamberlain for causing the war, rather unfairly. Hitler blamed Chamberlain for him losing the war because of the delay over the discussions around Czechoslovakia. It meant that the Allies had more time to arm when the war did finally begin. And perhaps most crucially, it meant that the invasion of the Soviet Union happened later, and that the weather turned before the Germans were able to take Moscow. Now, this could just be a point about the fact that some weapons had been funneled in by the West that proved decisive. It may be something about the election of President Zelensky and how decisive he has proven, but interesting nonetheless. And who knows, perhaps one day the insight that Putin's just offered there, whether candid knowingly or not, will prove correct.
Yeah, thanks, Francis. I mean, there's plenty of historical coincidences between Hitler and Putin, I'd suggest. I wonder, I mean, it might be the weapons you're talking about there, but of course, where did they come from? And that was political will. And I wonder if what he meant by that, and I don't think he was actually trying to give a real answer, but in his mind, I wonder if he thought, by saying earlier, he meant before the likes of Boris Johnson were on the scene. Now, whatever one's view is of Boris Johnson, he was absolutely on the money when it came to Ukraine. He was a stalwart supporter. He galvanised the international community in many ways. And I wonder if Putin's thinking, blimey, if only he'd gone before Boris Johnson was on the scene, it might have been very different. But, mighta, coulda, woulda, shoulda. If my aunt had balls, she'd be my uncle, you might say. Anyway, on that note, Hamish, final thoughts, please.
Thanks, Dom. Great there. Just the final one for me. I don't suppose I'll be on the pod again before Christmas, although delighted to if areas of my expertise come up. And I think just thinking about soldiers at Christmas, Dom, you and I on ops, no doubt, over Christmas, and we know what it's like. And a real shout out to all the British servicemen and women who are deployed this Christmas time. But just thinking about the Ukrainians on the front line, and quite how tough it is going to be for them over the Christmas period. I'm not a great attender at my local kirk, but I will be certainly lighting a candle on Christmas Eve for Ukraine. Slava Ukraini. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Hamish. And not that it's my place to say so, but somebody has to. Heroim Slava. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine Live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it's released, do refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Isabel Boujard. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Nicholls.